If all insects disappeared, all life on Earth would perish. So says the trailer of a new documentary called Insect-O-Cide, due to appear in August 2021. It says that human beings are on the verge of extinction due to the rapid decline of insect populations worldwide. This comes just ahead of the book that it's based on by Dave Goulson, Silent Earth, Averting the Insect Apocalypse. According to Goulson, there is a rapid worldwide decline, and the main cause is the indiscriminate use of chemical pesticides. If true, that is profoundly worrying, should be a call to immediate action. But is it true? Well, let's have a look. In advance of the launch of the film and the book, Dave Goulson has been doing the rounds. He appeared on the high-profile BBC Radio 4 Today programme, and he wrote this article, which appeared in The Guardian last week. Insect Apocalypse, our world will grind to a halt without them. And it's headed with this extraordinary, genuinely terrifying statistic. Insects have declined by 75% in the past 50 years, and the consequences may soon be catastrophic. Let's ignore for now the maybe catastrophic bit at the end. Headline writers thrive on coulds and perhaps and maybes from the extremely unlikely worst case scenarios, usually. But if insects worldwide have genuinely declined by 75%, as that says, that would be an alarm that is justifying of the word catastrophic. If you're not someone who's overly fond of bugs, you might say, who cares, who needs them? Well, we probably kind of do. Insects are the most abundant group of animals on the planet, with an estimated 5.5 million species overall, although that number has a significant margin of error. They play an important role in a lot of ecosystem functions, as pollinators, as nutrient recyclers, pest regulators, and of course as prey for predators. Lots of birds, fish, small mammals, and even in large parts of the world, human beings consume insects. So many things depend on them, including things upon which we depend. The first thing we do is to look at the main body of Goulson's article to find the detail of the specific claims that he's making and their sources. And he writes this: estimates vary and are imprecise, but it seems likely that insects have declined in abundance by 75% or more since I was 5 years old. It's a touch more hesitant than the subheading, but still very much broad in scope. The claim has a link to an older story, which is one that The Guardian published back in 2019, and that story said this: the world's insects are hurtling down the path to extinction, threatening a catastrophic collapse of nature's ecosystems, according to the first global scientific review. More than 40% of insect species are declining and a third are endangered, the analysis found. The rate of extinction is 8 times faster than that of mammals, birds and reptiles. The total mass of insects is falling by a precipitous 2.5% a year, according to the best data available, suggesting they could vanish within a century. So there's no new research behind the claims being presented here. The study he quotes is this one by Sanchez-Bayo and Weikhaus. The authors described it as a comprehensive review of published literature on insect decline, and they established that there was a 40% extinction rate. That sounds pretty hard to argue with. Except, actually, it turns out it's not that hard at all. The paper's methodology and conclusions were roundly criticised by a number of entomologists. They pointed out that the search terms that were used to find the relevant papers in the database were things like insects plus decline. Well, that self-selected for papers giving evidence of decline, but it missed those giving evidence for increasing or static populations. Whether intentional or not, the results it provided were cherry-picked for gloom. And then the description of it as a comprehensive review. Well, that wasn't true within its own terms for the reason I've just described, but in any case it becomes meaningless to use that label in this field because of how little research there actually is on insect populations. So, for instance, entomologist Manu Saunders criticised the 40% extinction rate described in the abstract, pointing out this: we don't even have the population data for 40% of the world's insect species. What the authors had done was to take studies, the majority of which were from certain parts of Europe, particularly Germany, and then decide that you could extrapolate out locally measured declines in those very specific locations to the whole of the world. And that is just completely unscientific. What does a study of butterfly decline in southern England tell you about insect decline in, I don't know, a Malaysian rainforest? Obviously, absolutely nothing. What is a study that looks only for declining species and ignores any others? What does that tell you about overall trends? Again, obviously nothing. To give some sense of this, the only insect species represented from Australia was commercially managed honeybee hives. Does that stand as a proxy for the hundreds of thousands of insect species in Australia? Obviously not. There are rather a lot of insects in Central Africa, Asia, South America. Those are some of the most ecologically rich and diverse regions in the entire world. But almost no studies. So really just a big fat question mark over what is or isn't happening in those places. And yet, the insect apocalypse is a highly compelling vision. Journalists are the moths, the insect apocalypse is the flame, and that means that this message has been magnified to huge proportions. And that's not to say it's not a real local phenomenon. There were certain sites in Germany where they had measured a 75% decline in insect biomass over 3 decades in that study. And significant declines have been seen elsewhere, including in parts of North America. But mostly, we just don't know. A recent paper on insect trends by Graham et al. Said this: important aspects of the insect decline phenomenon remain largely unknown. Most importantly, we need to understand how quickly populations are trending upward or downward. Annual declines of 1 to 2% for species in densely human-populated areas are unfortunate but relatively unsurprising, while over 3% annual declines for areas far removed from most human activities would be stunning. Failure to make such distinctions can lead to untenable extrapolations, e.g. that 40% of the world's insects will be extinct in a few decades, as posited in Sanchez-Bayo and Weikhaus 2019. Manu Saunders, who was involved with a review study, made this comment about the process so far. During the first revision, we've reviewed the studies that were underlying this apocalypse hype to identify the variation in trends across studies. And we were really surprised to discover how many of them we had to discard because they contained no data. But we were also able to quantify the geographic and taxonomic limitations of the evidence behind the hype. Only 18 countries, most in Europe and North America, and a handful of species groups in 10 taxonomic orders. Note, not all of those studies show declines. And this chart gives a visual representation which insects were studied in which countries, and most of these were highly specific to a few locations, not the country's overall populations. And some of the studies chose arbitrary times and dates to do sampling. Picking 2 random dates to sample like that can easily turn out to be misleading, because some insects have good years and bad years based on weather factors, land use changes, increases in predators, so you need regular long-term sampling to pick up proper trends. A study in 2001 showed that specialist butterfly species in the UK had declined, but mobile generalist species had increased. Now, if you looked at only one of those and not the other, you simply wouldn't get the true picture. Now, dodgy papers do get published in quality journals from time to time, and when that happens, over time they attract criticism and critique, sometimes leading to amendment, sometimes to outright retraction. But in an area with high media interest like this one, the speed involved means that it can go into very high public profile very quickly. So the Sanchez-Bayo and Weikhaus paper raced through 4 months from submission to publication and then instant global media coverage. So by the time the critiques started to appear, I think you could say the horsefly had long since left the stable. The headline writers rarely bother themselves with the details. So for instance, this important paper by Hallman et al. That showed an 82% midsummer decline in flying insect biomass since 1989 over multiple sites in Germany. Midsummer is where you expect to see the most insects, so it's definitely concerning. But did it justify the headlines that the paper generated? such as the global ecosystem is rapidly collapsing. Insect biomass plummets 75% in one generation. Scientists warn of decimation. Humanity may not survive much longer. No, not even close. The samples were taken at 63 sites, grouped in 2 regions of Germany, marked by yellow dots on this map. The sites were low-altitude nature protection areas within a human-dominated landscape. Not the sort of sampling that you can then take as being representative of the entire world. Interestingly, when the report was written up, Dave Goulson, again, was quoted in The Guardian speculating that pesticide use might well be responsible for these declines, which you might think is an odd conclusion. If all of those sites were nature protection areas and not farmland. The paper certainly didn't suggest such a thing. It didn't mention pesticides at all. But that didn't stop his apparent speculation being reported as one of the insights drawn from the actual study. As journalist John Entine has pointed out, Goulson has been associated with anti-neonicotinoid pesticide campaigning for many years. In a previous video, a couple of years back, I talked about how the bee apocalypse was similarly overhyped. While campaigners had initially talked about plummeting bee numbers and blaming neonicotinoid pesticides, more recent research had shown that the bees were not in great decline. Indeed, since the year 2000, honeybee populations have increased 30% worldwide. The issue that there was with the honeybee hives, something called colony collapse disorder, was both manageable and more attributable to the impact of the Varroa destructor mite, which you could see, for instance, because Australia did not see colony collapse disorder amongst its bees, and yet its farmers use neonicotinoid pesticides, but they don't have the Varroa mite. Most experts have accepted that research, which is, what scientists are supposed to do. When you get new information, you change or at least update your opinion. And even some journals that had initially talked up the bee apocalypse rode back their claims. Slate, the Washington Post, for instance. But not necessarily campaigners, some of whom become emotionally attached to their cause, and they tend to disregard evidence that contradicts their position. And it seems that as an early advocate of the honeybee catastrophe claims, Dave Goulson remains similarly untouched by recent evidence. The title of his forthcoming book, Silent Earth, is a deliberate echo of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the first book that highlighted the impact of chemicals in farming and kick-started the environmentalist movement. And the echo's deliberate. Goulson sees his book as the modern version of Carson's seminal work. It's all part of his declared war on agricultural chemicals. So expect that to feature in the wave of apocalyptic talk you may well hear over the coming few weeks. Does the science support it? I mean, it's all very well to say that the real issue is that we don't have studies from most parts of the world, and therefore we don't know. That doesn't in itself give us any comfort, because it could still be the case that declines are happening, they're just happening unseen. We definitely do need more research, and there are certainly some good studies that show declines in a number of locations. That said, there are also reasons to be reassured by some of the most recent work. A study published just last year by Van Klink looks at various data from 166 insect surveys from various parts of the world, although still constrained by the fact that most of those are from Europe and from North America. Terrestrial insects on average have been declining, although not as quickly as the apocalyptic narratives would paint, and this is variable, with species whose habitats are impacted by humans unsurprisingly declining more, whilst protected areas have a much weaker signal of decline. Meanwhile, freshwater insect populations have been increasing. Insect abundance in areas of crop cover were found to be positive, which isn't really compatible with the view that farming pesticides are universally laying waste to insect populations. And when it comes to other speculative causes, it's worth noting that the study found no detectable sign relating to climate change to date. Really, it seemed declines were mostly associated with habitat loss through urbanisation, and that areas where habitats had been improved, for instance with water quality measures, then that had been met with recoveries in populations. This was reinforced by a study also published last year looking at areas in the US with unspoiled habitats, ecological research sites. It found some species had declined, some had increased, but the vast majority of insects had stable numbers, a trend that was indistinguishable from zero. So where habitats have remained in good condition, there seem to be no wider factors driving changes, at least in the US. And that's pretty good news. I mean, if it holds true on a wider canvas, because restoring habitats is something we know we can do. The idea that if we reduced habitats by, say, 20%, that the number of insects declines accordingly, that isn't a surprise. But it doesn't suggest that there's a straight line trend that will continue regardless of what we do until there's no insects left. The insect apocalypse. But let's be clear, just because that would be comforting to believe doesn't in itself mean that it's proven to be true. Yes, this study pushes back against what does seem to have been biased earlier studies, the one that was only looking for declines, for instance, and that is encouraging. But we still know almost nothing about insect populations across the world. We certainly need to know a lot more than we do before you can count out the existence of serious problems. It just seems that campaigners who are quick to become rather fixed on a false belief and highly resistant to considering contrary evidence, they do not seem to be serving us well as agents to help work out what's actually going on. Part of the problem is that the stories of the insect apocalypse have been repeated so widely and so often that it's kind of entered people's sense that, this must be true. It becomes something of an article of faith. And once that happens, once you question it, then it's assumed that it's because you're badly motivated, you're one of these science deniers. But also because it's one of these issues that people hold to be intuitive. They sincerely believe is supported by what they see with their own eyes. So, one of the common things you'll hear is for older people like me, to say that there were a lot more insects around in their younger days. And often this is given the veneer of scientific observation when people say, we used to drive places and you would end up with all these bugs splattered on the windscreen. Whereas these days you hardly get any at all, and that must be a measure of how many fewer insects there are. Indeed, Dave Goulson himself uses this anecdote to support his case. I drove right across France and back this summer, just when you'd expect your windscreen to be splattered all over, and I literally never had to stop to clean the windscreen. There may or may not be fewer insects in any specific location, but there are a number of reasons why that is not a reliable indicator. Firstly, our memories of such things have been shown time and time again to be deeply flawed. For instance, you'd only notice how many insects there were when you were a young person, when you were in a place that, for whatever reason, there were loads of them. How often did that happen? What locations did that happen in? People don't remember that because, they weren't running a study. They were young people. They just noticed a couple of times there were lots of bugs. That then is a little parcel of memory that they recall decades later. But it doesn't tell you anything. I mean, a couple of years ago, I was in Southwold just as it got hit by thick swarms of ladybirds. I mean, they were everywhere. It was one specific day when there was a swarm. You couldn't help but notice. Now, a young person who was there on that day might well be thinking in a few decades' time how they remember there were loads more insects when they were a young person. And one of the little stores for evidence of that will be their memory of that one day. But it was just a day in one location. As for the windshield thing, it's prone to the same factor. There may have been certain journeys where you hit into an area where there were lots of insects, and you may well then recall how splattered your windscreen became, but you remembered it because it was unusual. It wasn't every journey. And more to the point, modern cars are much more aerodynamic than the cars of old. The air is pushed over the curve of the car so as to give the least resistance to the vehicle as it moves. So most of the insects are carried with it. And, look, if we're swapping anecdotes, only a couple of days ago I drove through a pretty hefty swarm of bugs as I came through nearby woodland on my way home. And there were no splatters at all as a result. There are some other factors. Some insects are more likely to splatter than others. Swarms of flying insects move around, so your experience on the same stretch of road will vary from time to time, day to day, year to year. So, look, it's just not a reliable measure. Full stop. But it fits people's intuitive perception that things are significantly different to how they used to be. And then people read the misleading headlines, they will find them all too believable, so they will just believe them. And maybe they should, maybe they're right, but the studies quoted in support of the panic doesn't provide the support for the conclusions that they say they do. So look, where does this leave us? I go back to Manu Saunders, whose words I thought provided the best summary. We disagree with the catastrophic decline narrative, not the concept of population decline, or that individual studies have shown declines in some places. Declines are probably happening elsewhere too, but we have no data to prove it. Yet other insects are not declining, and some are increasing in population size or range distribution. New species are being named every year, most of which we still know nothing about. Presenting the global decline narrative as consensus or fact is simply misrepresentation of science. By continuing to promote the narrative, we may suffer from confirmation bias, potentially encouraging scientists to look for evidence of declines in their data where there may be none. When I started doing deep dives on this channel into what does the science say about the current issues of focus, and I took this approach of deliberately casting aside all preconceptions and being open to the evidence and following wherever it went, this was the first topic that really surprised me by coming to a different conclusion to the one that I'd understood to be the case before I did the research. And here we are a couple of years later, and the new evidence that's come up since seems to confirm that that position still holds true. The science seems clear about what it knows, clear about what it doesn't know. Unfortunately, it isn't even close to where the public narrative is on this right now, fed by campaigners who seem to have taken against certain agricultural chemicals and seem determined to find some devastation that they can pin on them. Mainstream media outlets aren't helping by amplifying those narratives, and that's just adding to the fear that some people are feeling in the general sense that everything's going wrong. Well, some things are going wrong. We do have problems to solve. But in this area at least, those problems do not add up to any sort of apocalypse, nor the end of the world as we know it. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash it so.